Grace stood at the threshold of a new chapter in her life, her wedding dress shimmering in the soft light of the church. Guests filled the pews, their excited whispers barely audible over the swelling music. But there, in the aisle, was Hugo, the loyal German shepherd who had been her constant companion for over a decade. His amber eyes locked onto hers with a gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. Grace froze. "Hugo, come on, buddy," she whispered, trying to gently nudge him aside. But he wouldn't budge. The murmurs of the guests grew louder, and her father moved toward her, grasping for the leash. "Grace, we need to get moving," he urged, his voice tinged with impatience. But Hugo's low growl made even her father pause, a rare sound that caused Grace's heart to plummet. Something was wrong. Kneeling, her dress spilling around her, Grace cupped Hugo's face, her fingers brushing over the graying fur of his muzzle. "What's wrong, boy?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Hugo's shallow breathing and trembling legs made it clear this wasn't just wedding nerves. This was something far worse. Her mother's voice broke through the quiet desperation in Grace's mind. "Grace, we're running out of time. What's going on?" But Grace couldn't hear her. She couldn't think about the ceremony, the guests, or the ticking clock. All that mattered was Hugo, the dog who had stood by her through every heartbreak, every victory. Through years of thunderstorms, breakups, and new beginnings, he had been her anchor. And now, with his body failing him, she couldn't leave him behind. "I'm not leaving you," Grace whispered fiercely, her forehead pressed gently against his, her heart twisted. "I'm here." As Hugo leaned against her, struggling to breathe, Grace made a decision. "We're going to the vet," she said, her voice unwavering despite the storm swirling inside her. The shock on her mother's face was immediate. "The wedding, Grace." "It can wait," she urged, but Grace had already risen, gathering her skirts, determined. Lucas, her fiancé, stepped forward, his face full of concern. "Is everything okay?" he asked softly. Grace looked at him, her throat tight. She didn't have the words to explain, but Lucas, steady as always, understood. Without a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "You don't need to apologize. Hugo comes first." With the wedding paused, the guests watched in stunned silence as Grace, still in her wedding dress, led Hugo to the car. Lucas called the emergency vet as they made their way through the parking lot, and Grace's father explained the situation to the minister. The car sped toward the clinic, and in the back seat, Grace cradled Hugo's head in her lap, his body trembling against hers. Each shallow breath felt like a countdown. Lucas kept glancing back, trying to reassure her, but his tight grip on the wheel told a different story. "We're almost there," he said, his voice a little strained. The clinic's lights glowed warmly against the dark evening, and Dr. Peterson, Hugo's longtime vet, was waiting for them as they arrived. Inside, the antiseptic smell of the clinic was oddly comforting. Dr. Peterson was quiet but efficient, guiding Hugo onto the exam table as Grace kept her hand on him, offering him what comfort she could. Then the words she dreaded to hear. "Hugo's in advanced heart failure," Dr. Peterson said gently. "His symptoms have worsened with the stress of today. We can help keep him comfortable, but we're looking at months, not years." Grace's world tilted. The wedding, the guests, her parents, it all seemed distant, irrelevant now. She turned to Lucas, her hand tightening around his. "Is he in pain?" she whispered. "No," Dr. Peterson assured her. "But stopping you from walking down the aisle." That was his way of asking for help. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, her voice thick with grief. "I'm so sorry, Hugo, so sorry." Lucas cleared his throat, his voice calm but firm. "What's next, Doc?" Dr. Peterson outlined a treatment plan, but Grace barely heard him. She was lost in memories of Hugo's loyalty, the years they'd shared. The decision had already been made in her heart. "I need to stay with him," she said quietly. Lucas didn't hesitate. "Then we stay," he said, his hand tightening around hers in silent support. As they prepared for the hardest part of the day, the door to the clinic swung open, and Grace's parents stepped inside, followed by the minister and Sophie, her maid of honor. "We thought you might need some support," her father said, his voice softer than Grace had ever heard it. Her mother dabbed at her eyes, trying to maintain composure. Sophie, practical as always, raised her phone. "The guests understand. Maybe we don't have to cancel the wedding." The idea hung in the air, a possibility Grace hadn't considered. The minister, always kind, offered a smile. "If you're willing, we could hold a ceremony here with you." Grace turned to Lucas, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. He didn't hesitate. "It's not the wedding we planned," he said gently, "but it feels right." Grace, overwhelmed with emotion, smiled tearfully and nodded. "Let's do it." An hour later, the clinic transformed into an impromptu wedding venue. Hugo lay at their feet, his tail wagging faintly, as Grace and Lucas exchanged vows, their hands clasped tightly. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Hugo gave a soft, approving woofer sound that held more meaning than words ever could. Later, in the quiet of their apartment, still in wedding clothes, Grace and Lucas shared a quiet dinner. The three of them, Grace, Lucas, and Hugo, finding peace in the simple, beautiful moments of life. The months that followed were bittersweet. Hugo's health declined, but the time they had together was precious. On the tough days, Grace and Lucas stayed close, cherishing every moment, knowing that love isn't measured by time, it's measured by how deeply we live it. And when Hugo finally passed, they honored his memory not just in words, but in the way they lived. They gave love again, through Lucky, the senior dog they adopted from the shelter, whose eyes mirrored the same quiet devotion Hugo had once shown. The heart always has room to love again.